through the shadow of time. It was in the desert plains of Arizona where it all began. A seemingly endless expanse of red rock and dust stretching under a sun that hung low in the sky, its golden light casting long shadows across the jagged cliffs. James Carter stood on the edge of the canyon, his boots kicking up small clouds of rust-colored sand as he surveyed the land below. He wasn't a man who believed in omens or destiny. He was a scientist, grounded in fact, tethered to reality by data and equations. But this was something else entirely. Before him, in the heart of the canyon, was what the locals had come to call the Black Veil. A rippling, obsidian-like structure, it seemed to hover above the earth, anchored by nothing yet impossible to move. It shimmered faintly, absorbing the sunlight instead of reflecting it, its surface smooth yet alive with subtle undulations. James had heard rumors about the veil for years. Stories passed around by truck drivers, drifters, and park rangers about an anomaly that defied explanation. Objects thrown at it vanished. The sound of a heartbeat could be heard faintly when one stood too close. And then there were the whispers, the chilling accounts of those who claimed to see things in the veil. Shadows of people who didn't belong to this time, places that shouldn't exist in this world. It wasn't until his research grant from a prominent tech company, Syngene Industries, came through that James had been able to investigate the anomaly firsthand. Syngene wasn't exactly subtle about their ambitions. Their logo was plastered across the equipment he had hauled to the site, from the sleek drones to the portable quantum spectrometer humming softly beside him. He adjusted his sunglasses, the desert heat pressing against his skin like a living thing. His assistant, Evelyn Hart, was somewhere behind him, setting up the final calibration for the drones. The data they had collected so far made no sense. The veil emitted no radiation, no measurable energy signatures. It didn't interact with the environment around it. No wind, no dust clung to its surface. It was simply there. James had seen strange things in his career, but nothing like this. The veil wasn't just a mystery. It was an impossibility. As he stepped closer, the hum of the spectrometer grew louder, its sensors straining against the presence of the anomaly. James pulled out his notebook, scribbling down observations, his handwriting growing messier with each line. Surface tension, indeterminate. Gravitational pull, localized but negligible. Visual distortions, he paused, his pen hovering above the page. The distortions were faint but undeniable. When he looked directly at the veil, he could almost see shapes, shadows that moved independently of the wind or the sunlight. One shape, in particular, seemed to linger, a figure, tall and indistinct, standing just beyond the surface of the veil. James felt a chill creep up his spine despite the desert heat. He knew better than to believe in ghosts or spirits, but this felt like neither. He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. The veil pulsed. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but James felt it in his bones, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to hum within his chest. He hesitated, his breath catching. The figure in the veil shifted, moving closer, its edges sharpening as if stepping out of the fog. And then it was gone. The veil rippled, its surface trembling like disturbed water. James stumbled back, his heart racing. He turned toward the spectrometer, its screen flashing red as it emitted a series of frantic beeps. Energy spike detected, the machine's automated voice announced. Gravitational anomaly increasing. James barely had time to react before the veil surged forward, its black tendrils lashing out like living things. The world tilted as the veil surged forward. James felt the ground shift beneath his feet, the desert heat giving way to an unnatural cold that stabbed at his skin. He stumbled, dropping his notebook as the obsidian tendrils spiraled around him, not touching him but close enough to make every nerve in his body scream. The tendrils weren't solid, nor were they light or shadow. They existed somewhere in between, a flickering cascade of possibilities that rippled through the air. They danced and swirled, moving with an intelligence that defied explanation. "Evelyn!" James shouted, his voice hoarse, but the sound barely carried. It was as if the veil had swallowed the air, leaving nothing but a low, bone-deep hum. He turned toward the ridge where his assistant had been calibrating the drones, but she was gone. The equipment was still there, the spectrometer blinking red, the drones buzzing faintly in their docking stations, but Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. The tendrils pulsed, and James's attention snapped back to the veil. It was changing, its smooth, liquid-like surface folding in on itself. For the first time, James realized it wasn't just a surface. It was depthless, infinite, a window into something far larger than the desert canyon it occupied, and it was pulling him in. He tried to step back, but the ground shifted beneath him again, his boots sliding on loose gravel. The pull of the veil was growing stronger, a gravitational force that seemed to wrap around his chest, dragging him forward. "Think, James," he muttered under his breath, his mind racing. "Think." He reached for the spectrometer, its blinking screen displaying incomprehensible data. Gravitational waves spiked and dropped in chaotic rhythms, and the device struggled to keep up, its processor overheating. Suddenly, a burst of static erupted from the device, and a voice crackled through, a faint, broken signal. "James, can you hear?" His breath hitched. "Evelyn?" The static warped, and the voice returned, distorted but unmistakable. "Don't let it take you." James stared at the spectrometer, his heart pounding. The tendrils from the veil were closing in, their edges blurring as they merged with the air itself. The gravitational pull intensified, and James's legs buckled beneath him. And then, with a final, violent pulse, the veil consumed him. James expected darkness, cold, silence. Instead, he found himself standing in the middle of something. It wasn't the desert canyon anymore. It wasn't anywhere he could recognize. The ground beneath him was smooth and black, like polished glass, stretching endlessly in every direction. Above him, the sky, or what passed for it, was a swirling mass of colors and shapes, a kaleidoscope of shifting forms that defied logic. James turned in a slow circle, his breath catching in his throat. The air here felt heavy, charged with a strange energy that made his skin prickle. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice echoing strangely. As he took a cautious step forward, the glass-like surface rippled beneath his boots, as if it were alive. He froze, his heart pounding. The ripples spread outward, and the air around him shimmered. Shadows began to form in the distance, shapes coalescing into indistinct figures. They moved slowly, their outlines flickering like old film reels. "Hello?" James called out, his voice trembling. The figures didn't respond. They drifted closer, their movements disjointed and unnatural. James stepped back, his instinct screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows grew clearer, their forms sharpening into people, men, women, children, all frozen in expressions of fear, anger, sorrow. They weren't alive, not exactly. Their eyes were hollow, their faces blurred at the edges, as if they were trapped between moments in time. James felt his chest tighten. He had seen photographs of people lost in historical disasters, their faces caught in grainy black and white stills. These figures reminded him of those images, but they were moving, flickering, and impossibly real. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. One of the figures stepped closer. It was a woman, her features clearer than the others. She wore a dress that looked decades old, the hem stained with something dark. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. James strained to hear, leaning closer, and then he saw her eyes. They weren't hollow, like the others. They were dark and endless, filled with stars and galaxies swirling in infinite patterns. James stumbled back, his heart pounding. The woman raised a hand, pointing behind him. James turned slowly, his breath catching as he saw what lay ahead. It was a doorway, floating in the air. Made of the same obsidian material as the veil, it shimmered faintly, its edges rippling like heat waves. Beyond the doorway, James could see something. A city, vast and sprawling. Its skyline a mix of ancient structures and futuristic towers. The streets were alive with people and machines, their movements a chaotic dance of past and future colliding. James's instincts told him to stay away, to turn back, but he knew there was no turning back. The gravitational pull was still there, tugging at him, drawing him toward the doorway. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He thought of Evelyn, of the spectrometer, of the years he had spent chasing mysteries and answers. And then he stepped through. James's first sensation was heat. The air was thick and humid, filled with the sound of machinery and voices. He stood in the middle of a crowded street, the ground beneath him paved with cobblestones that gleamed as though freshly polished. Around him, the city buzzed with life. Vendors sold wares from wooden carts alongside sleek, floating kiosks displaying holograms of products. A massive clock tower loomed in the distance, its hands moving in impossible directions, ticking both forward and backward. James turned slowly, his eyes wide. The people here were dressed in a mix of styles: Victorian coats, futuristic jumpsuits, traditional garments from cultures across history. The city wasn't just a fusion of past and future, it was all time, layered and intertwined. Above him, massive screens displayed advertisements for brands that didn't exist yet, or had ceased to exist long ago. One caught his eye: Syngin Industries, shaping the future, preserving the past. James's breath caught. Syngin, the company that had funded his research, that had given him the resources to study the veil. They were here. But how? A sudden movement caught his attention. A group of figures in sleek, black uniforms was weaving through the crowd, their eyes scanning the streets with a predatory intensity. They carried devices that emitted a faint hum, their movements precise and synchronized. James's stomach twisted. He didn't know who they were, but he had no intention of finding out. He ducked into an alleyway, the shadows swallowing him. The alleyway was narrow and dark, a sharp contrast to the chaotic brightness of the street. James pressed himself against the cool stone wall, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The faint hum of the devices carried by the black uniformed figures echoed faintly, growing louder as they passed the mouth of the alley. He watched them carefully, their movements unervingly precise. Each figure was identical in height and build, their faces obscured by mirrored visors that reflected the fragmented city around them. They scanned the crowd like hunters, their devices emitting faint pulses of light that rippled across the cobblestones. When they finally moved on, James exhaled, his grip on the wall loosening. He had no idea who they were, but something about them felt wrong. They weren't searching randomly, they were searching for him. The thought made his stomach churn. He turned deeper into the alley, the narrow passage twisting like a maze. The further he went, the stranger the environment became. The walls shifted as he moved, their surfaces alternating between rough brick, smooth steel, and glowing crystalline panels. The air grew heavier, the hum of unseen machinery vibrating through his bones. As he rounded a corner, James came to an abrupt stop. The alley opened into a small courtyard, its center dominated by a massive, mechanical structure. It looked like a clock, but it wasn't just any clock. It was an impossibly intricate mechanism, its gears and cogs whirring silently as they spun in opposing directions. The face of the clock had no numbers. Instead, it displayed fragments of time, scenes from different eras flickering in and out of focus. James saw ancient battles, futuristic cities, and fleeting glimpses of faces he didn't recognize. But one face stopped him cold. It was his own. The image of himself appeared briefly on the clock face, frozen in an expression of fear and determination. It flickered and vanished before he could fully process it, replaced by another scene. James stepped closer, his breath catching. The machinery radiated an energy that was both magnetic and repellent, drawing him in even as it made his skin crawl. Etched into the base of the mechanism were words that sent a chill down his spine. Property of Syngin Industries, Temporal Node Prototype 3. James's hands clenched into fists. Syngin, the company that had bankrolled his research into the Veil, that had provided the technology he'd used in the canyon. It wasn't a coincidence. They had known. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. He turned sharply, his pulse quickening as one of the black uniformed figures stepped into the courtyard. The figure stopped, its visor reflecting the glowing clock. Subject identified, it said, its voice cold and mechanical. James didn't wait. He turned and ran. The city blurred around him as he sprinted through the labyrinth of streets and alleyways. Time itself seemed unstable here, the environment shifting and warping with every step. One moment, he was running past a row of Victorian storefronts. The next, he was in a futuristic plaza surrounded by towering skyscrapers. The ground beneath him cracked and reformed, cobblestones turning to glass, then to dirt. The black uniformed figures were relentless. Their footsteps echoed behind him, steady and unyielding. James's lungs burned, his legs threatening to give out, but he kept moving. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep running. Finally, he stumbled into what appeared to be an abandoned building. The walls were crumbling, the ceiling partially collapsed, but it was quiet. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to catch his breath. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound almost deafening in the silence. The room was dimly lit, but he could make out a large table in the center, covered in papers and strange devices. As he stepped closer, he realized the papers were blueprints. They depicted machines similar to the clock he had seen in the courtyard, massive, intricate mechanisms labeled temporal stabilizers. One of the blueprints caught his eye. It was labeled Temporal Nexus, Core Design. The diagram showed a massive machine, its center housing a glowing orb-labeled chrono core. The notes scrawled in the margins described the Nexus as the heart of the temporal network, a system designed to control the flow of time across all realities. James's stomach churned as he read further. The network wasn't just about stabilizing time. It was about rewriting it. Syngin had created the Veil, and others like it, as part of an experiment to manipulate timelines, to bend reality to their will. The anomalies, the fractures, the chaos he had seen. It was all a byproduct of their interference. A faint beeping pulled his attention away from the blueprints. He turned to see a small device sitting on the table, its screen flickering. It was a tracker, and it was pointing directly at him. Before James could react, the sound of footsteps filled the air. The black uniformed figures had found him. He grabbed the tracker and bolted for the nearest exit. The blueprints burned into his mind. James's escape led him to the outskirts of the city, where the architecture gave way to barren landscapes and fractured time zones. He found himself standing at the edge of a vast, glowing field, its surface rippling like liquid glass. In the distance, he saw it. A massive tower rising into the swirling sky, its spires crackling with energy. The temporal nexus. James tightened his grip on the tracker, its screen displaying a faint map of the surrounding area. The nexus was marked at the center, its coordinates pulsing steadily. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know how he was going to stop it. But he knew one thing. Sinjin had gone too far, and it was up to him to set things right. The temporal nexus loomed ahead, its jagged spires stabbing into the swirling, fractured sky. James stood at the edge of the glowing field, the tracker in his hand pulsing faintly with each step he took forward. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural energy that made his skin prickle and his thoughts feel sluggish. The ground beneath his feet was alive, rippling and shimmering as though it weren't entirely solid. It reflected distorted images of the sky above, but as James moved, the reflections twisted and shifted, showing glimpses of other places, forests, cities, deserts, oceans, all bleeding into one another. This was the boundary of the nexus. He could feel its pull, the gravitational force growing stronger with each passing second. James took a deep breath and stepped onto the field. The surface gave slightly under his weight, like stepping onto a thin sheet of ice. He forced himself to move forward, each step more difficult than the last as the pull of the nexus grew stronger. The spires of the nexus towered above him now, their surfaces covered in glowing, shifting symbols that seemed to ripple like liquid. Tendrils of energy arced between them, crackling with a sound that vibrated deep in his chest. As James approached the base of the nexus, he saw an entrance. A massive archway carved into the structure, its edges pulsing with the same symbols that covered the spires. The tracker in his hand buzzed violently, its screen flashing red. "This is it," James muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the nexus. He stepped through the archway. Inside, the nexus was a labyrinth of corridors, their walls glowing faintly with the same liquid-like symbols. The air was colder here, the hum of the machinery vibrating through the floor and into his bones. The tracker screen displayed a crude map of the structure, the chrono core marked at its center. James followed its guidance, his footsteps echoing eerily in the empty halls. As he moved deeper into the nexus, the walls began to shift, their surfaces flickering between solid and translucent. Through the translucent sections, James could see flashes of other places, snippets of timelines bleeding into the nexus. One moment, he saw a bustling marketplace filled with people in medieval clothing. The next, a futuristic cityscape with flying vehicles zipping between towering skyscrapers. James's breath hitched when he saw a familiar image. The canyon in Arizona where the veil had first appeared. The equipment he and Evelyn had set up was still there, the spectrometer blinking faintly in the distance. The sight sent a wave of grief through him. Evelyn. He hadn't seen her since the veil had consumed him. Was she still out there, or had the nexus taken her too? He shook the thought from his mind and pressed on. The closer he got to the chrono core, the more unstable the nexus became. The corridors twisted and warped, their angles defying logic. Gravity shifted unpredictably. One moment he was walking upright, the next he was climbing sideways or floating briefly before his feet found purchase again. The tracker screen began to glitch, its map distorting and flickering. James clenched it tightly, using it as his only guide through the chaos. Finally, he reached a massive circular chamber. The chrono core floated at its center, suspended by streams of energy that arced between it and the walls. It was a sphere of pure light, its surface alive with shifting colors and patterns that seemed to contain entire universes within them. The hum of the nexus was deafening here, the air vibrating with an intensity that made James's skin crawl. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on the core. He could feel its power radiating outward, a gravitational force that seemed to pull at every cell in his body. As he approached, a voice echoed through the chamber, calm, mechanical, and deeply unsettling. "Welcome, James Carter. Temporal anomaly detected. Synchronization required." James froze, his heart pounding. "How do you know my name?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the energy streams connecting the core to the walls began to shift, their arcs narrowing and focusing on him. The core pulsed, its surface rippling like water. "You are an unauthorized presence. Synchronization is required to preserve temporal stability." James's mind raced. He didn't know what synchronization meant, but he was certain it wasn't good. He glanced at the tracker in his hand. Its screen displayed a new message. "Core override possible. Manual access required." James's gaze shifted to the base of the core, where he saw a small console embedded in the platform. He didn't hesitate. He ran. The core reacted instantly. Streams of energy lashed out, striking the platform around him and sending shards of glowing material flying. The ground beneath his feet trembled, but James didn't stop. He reached the console and slammed the tracker into its docking port. The screen lit up, displaying a series of commands and incomprehensible data. James's hands flew over the controls, his instincts guiding him as he searched for the override. The core pulsed again, and the voice returned. "Manual override detected. Warning. System destabilization imminent." James ignored the warning, his focus narrowing as he found the command he needed. "Override. Shut down core." His finger hovered over the confirmation prompt. Before he could press it, the core flared brighter, its energy intensifying. The chamber shook violently, and James was thrown backward, his head slamming against the platform. For a moment, everything went black. When James opened his eyes, the chamber was collapsing. The walls were cracking, the energy streams flickering wildly. The core pulsed erratically, its light dimming and flaring in rapid succession. James forced himself to his feet, his vision swimming. He stumbled back to the console, his hand trembling as he reached for the confirmation prompt. The voice returned, louder now, almost desperate. "Warning. Shutdown will result in complete destabilization of temporal network. All connected timelines will collapse." James froze. His breath came in shallow gasps as he processed the words. If he shut down the core, he wouldn't just destroy the Nexus. He would destroy every timeline connected to it. The fractured city, the remnants, the people trapped within the chaos, they would all be erased. But if he didn't shut it down, the Nexus would continue to expand, consuming everything in its path. James's hands clenched into fists. There was no winning, no way to save everyone. James stood frozen at the console, his breath ragged, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. The glowing confirmation prompt hovered on the screen before him, its light casting sharp shadows across his face. Around him, the temporal nexus was tearing itself apart, the energy streams flaring and collapsing as the structure groaned under its own instability. "Warning. Temporal collapse imminent," the mechanical voice repeated, its tone colder, more insistent. "All connected timelines at risk. Immediate action required." His hand hovered over the screen, trembling. The words echoed in his head. "Shutdown will result in the collapse of all connected timelines." How many lives? How many places? How many realities would he destroy with the press of a button? But if he didn't, James glanced at the core. The once brilliant sphere of light was now pulsating chaotically, its surface cracking and bleeding streams of raw energy. He could feel it in his bones. The core was growing more unstable by the second. If it wasn't stopped, it would consume everything, stretching its influence across space and time until no reality remained intact. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just about Sin Jin's reckless ambition. This was about the fabric of existence itself. He swallowed hard, his thoughts racing back to the fractured city, to the faces of the remnants, those frozen echoes of lives that no longer fully existed. And then, to Evelyn. He hadn't seen her since the veil had taken him, but she had tried to warn him, "Don't let it take you. Had she fallen victim to this, too? Was she still out there somewhere, lost in the chaos? His chest tightened as another thought struck him. If the core's influence spread, Sophia, his little girl, asleep in her room back in the canyon, wouldn't be safe. The ripple could reach her, twisting her reality into something unrecognizable. Or worse, erasing her entirely. James clenched his jaw. There was no choice. Not really. He took a deep breath, his hand steadying as he reached for the confirmation prompt. The moment his finger touched the screen, the chamber erupted into chaos. The core let out a deafening roar, its light flaring so brightly that James had to shield his eyes. The energy streams lashed out in all directions, shattering the walls of the nexus and sending shockwaves rippling through the structure. The ground beneath him cracked and splintered, glowing fissures spreading like veins. Core shutdown initiated, the voice announced. Temporal destabilization in progress. James staggered back, his legs barely supporting him as the entire nexus began to collapse. The tracker on the console emitted a series of frantic beeps before its screen went dark, consumed by the core's failing energy. The light in the room grew blinding, swallowing everything. James felt the pull of gravity shift violently, dragging him toward the core. He grabbed onto a nearby railing, his knuckles white as he fought to hold on. And then, in a single, agonizing moment, the core exploded. James expected pain, destruction, an overwhelming void. But instead, there was nothing. He floated in silence, suspended in a formless expanse. There was no light, no darkness, no sensation of time or space. He felt weightless, untethered, as though he no longer had a body to ground him. For a moment, he thought he was dead, that the explosion had consumed him, erasing him from existence along with the Nexus and all the timelines it had connected. But then, he felt something. A faint pull, like a thread tugging at the edges of his consciousness. It was distant, but insistent, drawing him forward. As he focused on it, the void began to shift. Shapes emerged, indistinct at first, but growing clearer with each passing moment. He saw glimpses of places and people, fragments of timelines that flickered like old film reels. And then, he was falling. James hit the ground with a force that knocked the wind out of him. He gasped, coughing as he scrambled to his hands and knees. The air was sharp and cool, and the faint smell of dust and sagebrush filled his lungs. When he looked up, his heart stopped. He was back in the canyon. The veil was gone. The jagged spires of rock stretched high into a sky that was now a deep, unbroken blue. The desert was silent, save for the faint rustle of the wind through the brush. James staggered to his feet, his legs unsteady. The equipment he and Evelyn had set up was still there, though much of it was damaged, drones lying scattered, the spectrometer cracked and lifeless. "Evelyn," he called, his voice hoarse. There was no answer. He turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of her, but the canyon was empty. James's shoulders sagged, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The Nexus was gone. The timelines it had consumed were gone. And Evelyn, he swallowed hard, refusing to let his thoughts linger. He didn't have time to grieve. Not yet. He needed to be sure. When James returned to the apartment above the auto shop, it was past midnight. The lights were off, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the quiet kitchen. He walked slowly to Sophia's room, his heart pounding in his chest. He paused at the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. What if she wasn't there? What if something had gone wrong? What if he had failed? James pushed the thought aside and opened the door. Sophia was asleep, curled up under her blankets, her stuffed rabbit tucked against her chest. Her soft, even breaths filled the room, and James felt his knees buckle with relief. He sank to the floor, his head in his hands. She was safe. The timeline was safe, but at what cost? In the days that followed, James tried to return to normal. He went back to work, cleaned up the remnants of his equipment in the canyon, and avoided questions about what had happened to Evelyn. But late at night, when the world was quiet, he could still feel the echoes of the Nexus. The faint hum in the back of his mind, the flicker of light at the edges of his vision. And sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the remnants, their hollow eyes staring back at him. The timeline was stable. The veil was gone. But time was never truly fixed. And neither was he.